I want to go back to the idea of being the outsider, being the only, perhaps in certain situations. Um, what gave you the courage and the confidence to not let that be a stumbling block? Because for so many, it becomes an identity and a defining, limiting belief that says, I'm not like the rest. I don't know if I have permission. I don't know if I can do that. And you've broken all of those rules.
Um, let's just say I was a late bloomer because it took a long time to be comfortable with being an outsider and to realize
Mm,
that being an outsider is actually an asset.
mm,
So even from the time, so my parents are immigrants. They still don't speak much English. They live in an area in California where they don't have to speak much English
mm,
actually, and so and so I always felt like an outsider even from an early stage.
mm,
I'm sure you've been an only before. There were certainly times throughout my from elementary school where I was the only one, and being called names and things like that as
mm,
you're growing up. It's something that I think that many of us have dealt with, and
yeah.
frankly many of us have dealt with things far worse than I have. And
Mm,
so from an early stage I always wanted to be like assimilated. The only thing I wanted to do was be like everyone else. And and so um and so so from the time, and let's just start with being when I took the job as the first patent counsel hire at Cisco. Like, I'm the only one who was hired in that position who didn't have a technical degree.
mm,
And I had known the person who was hiring, and so relationships are important, and people who will say, you don't have the typical background, but I'm going to hire you anyway because
because
I
they
think
see
that
something in you.
because there's something that's in you. And I try to do that too. And because so many people helped me by
Mm,
saying, hey, you don't look like anything we've ever funded or hired before, but we think that you have something. So even from that time, which was I had gotten the offer, and then even the night before, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like, my job is now going to be 100% patents, whereas before it was only part of what I did. I'm like, I don't have a technical degree. I'm going to be I'm going to be reading patents all day, and I'm going to be doing all this. And, and, um, and so, so the funny story is that I had that sort of, oh my God moment. And then my boss, who was a white male, who's super supportive, who I'd worked with before, actually had a little bit of that moment. He's like, oh my God, I get one hire. And I just hired someone who's not technical. What happened was, and I've never actually told the story before, is that his wife was like, who knew me too. He's like, are you crazy? Like, trust your gut. Like, and she's great. And it ended up being awesome. But even both of us were like, so you have to have confidence actually on both sides, which
mm,
is he was the boss, but he had to have the confidence to say, hey,
take a
you don't
chance
look
on it.
like
Yeah.
anyone else, but I believe that you have something that is going to make you even more successful. And then me to say, like, oh God, I don't have that background. Like, maybe I shouldn't do it. To say, you know what, if someone believes in you, you can do it, and you can bring things. And then the other thing, that same boss would say to me regularly, hey, the reason why you're so good at this is because you think outside the box.
Mhm.
And secretly inside I would say, that's because he doesn't realize that I don't know enough to know what the box is.
I love that.
because like I didn't know that that was how it was always done. And so
Mhm.
for years I actually felt like, God, I wish I had a technical degree. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. I wish I had been part of a company that everyone had heard of. I wish I had done this. And then I started to realize somewhere along the way that the reason why I've been so successful in some of the things that I've done is precisely because I was an outsider and I didn't know what the
Mm,
confines of the box are. So it allows you to question, like, it allows you to think differently than what the traditional someone who has been in that area their entire lives. And so it becomes a huge benefit, and it's incredibly freeing. It just took me a long time to realize that, hey, that's great. And so I love hiring people who don't, and bringing on people and interacting with people and funding people who, you need to know enough about an industry so that you're not just taking everything from scratch. But it's good to actually not be someone who is so entrenched in, oh, this is the way it's done, so this is how we have to do it. And so it
right.
becomes a big benefit. That is something that took me a long time, though, to be comfortable with, because I so wanted to be like, to have the traditional background that everyone else had.
How do you get past that common objection or concern that, well, I love my female friends, but I don't want to ask them for help and make them feel like I'm using them, or, I don't want to bring transaction into a friendship. Men do it all the
Yeah.
time. How do you
Uh,
help them get past that?
so there's this piece that I wrote in Fortune that was published in August 2018, and it's called Women's Friendships. Actually, it's called, they actually put, I didn't quite know what the title they were putting on. They put it on How Friendship Holds Women Back in Their Careers and What They Can Do About It. So, so when I first thought, I'm like, oh, everyone's going to think I'm trashing women's friendships. And I was actually a little bit hesitant because I actually wrote this piece for like a year and sat on it because I'm
Wow.
like, oh, I don't know if I want to say this because, but I actually heard almost no negative
Mhm.
comment, which is like, this is the elephant in the room. Thank you for talking about this.
Yes.
So on two ends, which is, um, was trying to figure out why, despite like all this power with like female empowerment and friendships and stuff, why why there was this thing that was holding women back from turning that into
Mhm.
business. And so so I interviewed a lot of people, and what women were telling me was when they asked for a friend for business, just like you just said, they feared it would damage their personal relationship.
Mhm.
um, and when they did ask and got a no, and sometimes it was a yes, but oftentimes it was a no, they took it personally too. It's like, oh my God, I knew I shouldn't have asked, right? It's like now I've like ruined our
Yeah.
relationship and our
Now
friendship.
they're always
Um,
going to think badly about me for
yeah,
the rest of our lives.
yes, it's like they're always gonna, and then you become gun shy about asking again because
Yeah.
you're like, oh my God, I finally worked up the courage to do it, and they said no, and now they're gonna hate me, or they're gonna think that this is all I wanted. And so and even and sometimes people would ask and they'd actually get no response,
Mhm.
right? And so it's actually, um, they weren't wrong, the women who said like, hey, I've damaged my relationship or whatever, because on the other side, women who received and asked for a friend, because I also asked them, like, have people been pitching you, what is your response, is it was too unexpected. Like the women didn't expect that the friends to hit them up for business because it's not second nature the way it is with men. And then when they did have to say no, it did create this tension. And so, and some of them actually even did start doubting, like, well, were we friends, like, did you do this because you wanted my business, or did you want to be friends with me truly? And so so the baggage is actually real on both sides. And so I looked at, well, what are the reasons behind this, and talked to men. And when one example they gave me was, well, what I found was that women's friendship, when you get to know women
Mhm.
and you meet someone at a conference or otherwise, you tend to go very personal very quickly.
Yes.
um, which is um, which is like, we had a chance to talk a little bit this morning. It's like, we know about your marriage, we know about how you met, right? We know about kids, we know about the dogs, we know about, a sick family member, all in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So when I talk to the men, and we know this, but I actually went through an interview, and he's like, well, the conversation I have with a guy the first time I meet him is pretty much the same conversation I have 25 years later.
Huh.
So when you're trying to bridge between intensely personal to
Mhm.
business, you can't make
Mm.
that jump abruptly. You have to bridge. And so I talk a little bit about this in the op-ed that I wrote, and I won't go into all of it now.
Mm.
Whereas the men are close to being a transactional relationship in the first place. And so that's why when I started Operator Collective, I'm like, I'm going to take the fact that I'm not going to tell women to be more transactional. What I'm going to do is meet somewhere in the middle, which is what's so wonderful about knowing all those personal things and celebrating people's personal successes and knowing about their kids. Um, is to say that's going to be part of what makes us successful.
Mm.
And so that article led me to say, okay, I'm going to create something that is going to I'm going to find a way to harness all of that incredible talent, but
Mhm.
make it easy and comfortable for women, mostly women, to come together.
Let's talk about just expanding your own personal networks, for
Okay.
the sake of advancement.
Yeah. So when I was at Cisco, Cisco was great, by the way. Working for big companies is I think a huge benefit. You get so much training and that you just don't get in a startup, which is and startups are wonderful too. I love startups. But if you are in a big company or you're thinking about going into a big company, I actually think that it's a great thing to do as part of your career, because you will get more training and more guidance and more
How
structure
that works.
that will. So I got a lot of training. When I was going through it, I'm like, oh my God, I can't ever get my work done, right? I can remember this management training and this speaking training and things like that. And so one of and Cisco was very much a feedback culture. So I get a lot of feedback, like good and bad. But now I embrace it all, even though sometimes I wanted to hide from the feedback. And so one of the pieces of feedback I got was, um, so this also goes back to, you get a lot of advice where you might initially say, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense, or you dismiss it. So one piece of advice I got from someone was, you should be more political. And I was like, ew, like, who wants to be political? Like, I don't want to be political. Like, that's not genuine. But when someone says something, maybe they don't say it in a way that there's always a deeper meaning behind it.
Mhm.
And so I thought about it for a long time, and it took me a while to realize what he meant. And what I should have actually done earlier was that you should be more deliberate about relationship building.
Mm.
Because what happened is, again, like a lot of women and maybe people of color and immigrants and others, I was so heads down doing my work all the time and just like trying to crank and do a good job. And so the people that I happened to work with like knew me and I was well regarded, but I never deliberately tried to like continue a relationship with them or be like, oh gosh, it'd be great to work on a project with that person, because it was just literally whatever came my way, I would crank through. And if you happen to know me, then you happen to know me. But I wasn't deliberate about like, hey, I would love to work with Jay Shree more.
Mm.
And let's look for a way. But then there's a balance too, because it's not just like, hey, can you have a coffee? Because I've had people who've said, hey, can you have a coffee? And those sometimes get painful when there's actually not a purpose for the
Mhm.
coffee.
Yeah.
And so tie it to something that is meaningful and helpful to that very, very busy person that you're asking for a
Mhm.
coffee from or whatever. Or look for a way to work on a project together. So I think that helps. So that's one piece, which was be more deliberate about relationship building and solidify and keep in touch with those people. But don't do it in a way that just is wasting time either,
Mhm.
because there are certain um, if you're an Asian woman who was rising up the ranks, a lot of times they would get put with me, right? Just like, I mean, they just would. And I was happy to meet with them. And after the first coffee, sometimes I got to admit, they were a little bit painful, because if there was nothing that we were working on, we kind of ran out of things to talk about.
Yeah.
And I can't help, because I can't then say, hey, I'm going to recommend you for this board position or this advisory position or this, because I've actually never worked with you on anything. Like, yeah, she's pleasant to have coffee with. And
Mhm.
so look for ways of working on committees. Is it a nonprofit? Is it organizing a conference?
Mhm.
Is it, hosting podcasts, right? Is it, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, or can I help you with X? And a lot of times it is stuff outside of your normal job, but I think sometimes we focus too much of being perfect at just our normal, job, because we're trying to be
Mhm.
perfect at it, is
Yeah.
to look for opportunities to do that, to build relationships. So I wish I had done that earlier. I do know a lot of people, but I probably would know twice as many people that I had strong relationships with had I actually been deliberate, as opposed to just keeping my head down.
When you look forward into the future, you are such a visionary on a mission to build a better world. What's your biggest dream looking forward? What's your biggest hope?
So I hope that the world becomes such that, and I mentioned this before, that to be successful, you don't have to shift into the traditional construct of what the corporate world is, but that the world can be a little kinder and gentler, and show that you can treat people well. You can put culture first. You can build relationships and still build ultra successful companies.